Today's World Insight with Tian Wei. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe on a charm offensive in Europe and North America ahead of the G20 summit in Osaka. What's on the agenda? And all aboard the Belt and Road that's expected to breathe new life into South-South cooperation. How?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We begin today's show with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who started his 8-day trip covering France, Italy, Belgium, Slovakia, the US, and Canada. Mr. Abe said the trip would secure cooperation for the upcoming G20 summit in Osaka. The Japanese Prime Minister is expected to discuss a range of issues with his counterparts during the trip, including the global economy and international rules on how to utilize big data. For more on Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's trip, joining us in Hong Kong, we have Kato Yoshikazu, who is an adjunct associate professor from the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. In Washington, D.C., we are joined by Douglas Paul, Vice President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Beijing studio, Liu Ming Li, Associate Fellow at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. I want to welcome the three of you. So, of course, go to you first, Mr. Kato. What can we expect from Prime Minister's trip to Europe and some of the other countries?
This is going to be around a 1-week trip and to Europe and United States and Canada. And I think now Shinzo Abe is trying to host G20 summit in Osaka at the end of June. So first of all, Shinzo Abe is trying to conduct policy coordination and trying to get some consensus on a couple of very important issues on world economy, particularly with the Europe and the United States. It's a very important, kind of allies who share the liberal democracy and capitalism. So this is the most important objective of Prime Minister Abe.
Of course it is, but will reaching consensus with the European partners be able to push the United States also agree on certain kinds of multilateral platform or mechanism? That's still a question, isn't it, Mr. Paul?
Well, it is. I think the administration is still very much focused on bilateral deals, but not so often discussed is the administration's desire to see reform of the World Trade Organization. And there, the U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer has been talking to his counterparts in Japan and Europe. And I think that will be one of the important items on the agenda for the G20 meeting in late June.
Certainly, it will be very important for G20. Now, Mr. Liu, in Beijing, China also a very important contributor to the international multilateral mechanisms such as WTO. Now, reform can be very controversial. According to very different economies, they have what they consider as the best way to do it. Now, Mr. Liu, what do you make of Prime Minister Abe's visit to these countries, obviously to seek consensus?
Yes, the reform of WTO is a hot topic, but it is very complicated because every country proposes their own ambitions or suggestions to the reform, but there are two divergent opinions. How to make consensus is a very serious challenge for Japan because this country will hold the G20 summit in June. I think this one of the meetings of Japanese Prime Minister this visit to the Europe and United States, where you can find these four of the biggest economies of the G20. So it's a very important trip, I think.
Certainly, it's an important trip. But Mr. Kato, if you think about Japan's role over the past few years, particularly when the Trump administration coming into power, you see Japan tries to play a much more instrumental role on building and maintaining multilateral platforms, whether it is CPTPP, whether it's negotiation with China as well, together with others on RCEP, or so-called reform of the WTO, certainly with the rotating presidency of G20 this year. Prime Minister Abe has been playing quite multilateral role here, but the question really is, will Japan be able to make it, given the fact that Washington is still providing so-called a security guarantee for Japan. And in previous rounds of strategic consultations, it's usually Washington that would make its what consider as the deal, rather than the other way around with Tokyo.
Now, U.S.-Japan alliance is facing to somehow critical point. But I think security alliance between U.S. and Japan has been here, and I think still playing a very important role. And now, as you mentioned, now Shinzo Abe is trying to implement a kind of proactive and comprehensive diplomacy. Of course, TPP 11 is one of them. And now looking at RCEP, it's a kind of 10 plus 6 in Asia Pacific. And actually looking at Europe, now last year Japan and European Union signed the economic partnership agreement, and this is actually have been done after the more than 5 years negotiation. So now Shinzo Abe is trying to implement some kind of leadership beyond the region. So I think this is very good for ensure the security and prosperity in the Asia Pacific region. And I think, of course, we hope the United States could be playing more, positive and constructive role in this region. But now it's a kind of chance for Prime Minister Abe to achieve a kind of political assets and diplomatic achievements at this moment.
There's always a very interesting situation, shall we say, between Tokyo and Washington. Tokyo, Mr. Paul, always aspire to play a bigger role in the region and beyond, but Washington, of course, have its own concerns and the framework with which it hopes Tokyo could function. Now, this is an administration that's functioning apparently very different from the previous one. So that kind of a situation, will the nature of it change, Mr. Paul?
Well, I think the change that's really, the Trump administration is very different from previous administrations in its conduct of diplomacy, although the main policy currents are not that different from previous administrations. Where we see something quite new is the activism of Shinzo Abe as prime minister. This is not new. He's been doing it since he took office a few years ago. But we are not used to having Japanese take the initiative, Japanese get on their planes and fly around the capitals to embark on infrastructure and other kinds of international programs to really reinvigorate Japan's diplomacy. And of course, this is not just for Abe himself. He's got to host the World Olympics, the Summer Olympics in 2020. And he's got outstanding territorial issues with Russia and China that he'd like to chip away at, although resolution is not easy to accomplish. He's been trying to reduce tensions with China, and China has, for its part, cooperated in doing so that high-level meetings can take place this year between the two sides. So it's a comprehensive reinvigoration of Japanese diplomacy, and the U.S. has no problem with that.
Mr. Liu, of course, it's a very interesting situation. On the one hand, you see the activism, put it in the words of Mr. Paul, of Prime Minister of Japan. On the other hand, you also see different players that Japan tangle with have been reacting differently. For example, China has been, Mr. Liu, quite cooperating with Japan regarding some of the issues, particularly in terms of trade. But the WTO reform is another thing, because Japan, together with the EU and the United States, most of it certainly belongs to the developed economies, and China believes it is the biggest developing country inside the WTO rules. There are a lot of differences as to how these two kinds of economies are likely to be treated. So here's the thing. Besides the warming up of bilateral relations, apparently, Mr. Liu, will China and Japan see eye to eye on the reform of WTO? Will Japan, this time representing developed economies' interests, be able to do its job with China?
I think so far we have observed very friendly cooperations between China and Japan at a bilateral level. But in multilateral level platform, I think China and Japan still have consensus. Though China is a developing country and Japan is one of the developed countries. There are differences between them, and I think compared with China, maybe Japan has some similar positions with U.S. and Europe. But as two biggest Asian economies, there are consensus between these two countries. For example, these two countries are open economy, heavily depend on foreign market and investment. So the international system, current system, serve the interest of the two countries. At least the existence of the current system, for example, WTO, serve the interests of the both sides. And at least I think there is a consensus between these two countries to maintain this system.
Well, talking about maintaining the system, Mr. Liu, I have to ask you further about that, sir. What is the way as China is thinking about maintaining the system? Because these kind of phrases can be interpreted in so many different ways according to different economies. Mr. Liu.
I think, according to my own observation, the biggest challenges WTO maybe face in the future is the crisis of the dispute settlement mechanism, because the judges, not many of the judges is being blocked by the United States. If they change go on, maybe this dispute mechanism will in crisis in the future. That will be a really disaster for this system. So I think both China and Japan, I think including the European countries, they have the consensus.
Probably Canada too.
Yes, in regards to reform, we have different opinions how to reform this system. But I think most the majority of the countries of WTO members, they have concerns on that. At least the WTO is not perfect, but it is better than nothing.
I see. Mr. Kato, so Mr. Liu is diplomatically suggesting that the top priorities of so-called reform of WTO should start from making the WTO function, at least not collapsing and not paralyzing, which is to do something about the appellate body, make sure 3 judges are still there.
Yeah, I think so. Of course, how to define the WTO reform, maybe some controversy. But I think at least Japan now is trying to promote, at least promote and ensure the multilateralism and free and fair trading system. And this world should be, established by the rules-based and value-based, trading system. And this is what Japan wants to ensure. And at this point, Japan, EU, and the United States should coordinate together. So that's why I think focusing on Abe's visit this time, I think the policy coordination would be very important.
So, Mr. Paul, you can hear from Mr. Kato's also diplomatic answer. That is, it seems that the 3 kinds of economies, EU, Japan, the United States, during this trip by Prime Minister Abe, it's about correlating on the principles, so-called, of reform of WTO. Well, Mr. Liu from China earlier, Mr. Kato also agreed that Japan and China could work on together now about the WTO is make sure the appellate body still function as it is. So how do you see these different layers, obviously, of discussions and the nature of it?
Well, there are two topics on WTO reform that we have not touched on so far. One of them is the outsized role of state-owned enterprises, which have developed in China and which have had an alleged market distorting effect that needs to be addressed through multilateral mechanisms. These were not on the agenda previously because the world had not seen state enterprises of the size that China has now built. And so that's a very important topic for the other markets. A third issue area that has not yet been discussed is e-commerce. You know, when WTO was formed, the internet world of business was not yet up and running, but now it constitutes a vast amount of international commerce, and they need to find ways to establish rules. As we see, Europe has brought in the GDPR, these new rules on privacy. China has its own firewalls. Japan and the US are pretty open, but we are under pressures to do more to protect our users, to protect people from being hacked, and to facilitate flows of data. And those things need to be addressed as well. These are not easy. These will be difficult to address over a long term.
But Mr. Liu, those issues are important, but does China consider it as the most important one in terms of the trade rules and the future of WTO and China's expectation and observation of the future trip made by the Prime Minister of Japan to European countries, Canada and the United States?
I think China is one of the most important partners within the WTO framework. If we take a broader view, we can find that there are other players are also very important. For example, United States and Europe. As a scholar on European studies, we can find that there are still differences between Europe and the United States. Even within the G7 framework, there are a lot of differences between Japan, Europe and the United States. It is even difficult for these developed countries to make consensus. When we add China and maybe India, other developing countries together, so the reform is really complicated.
So that's why the trip, I mean, Mr. Kato, we are talking about, maybe Prime Minister does enjoy the fanfare of having a shuttling diplomacy as he has been capable of doing, but the result of it, will it really match his beautiful expectations? That is the question.
Yeah, that's a question. But I think at this moment for Prime Minister Abe, you know, if he can reach a certain terms of consensus on world economy and some geopolitical issues such like Iran or North Korea, and actually he can establish some more personalized and friendship and trust among these leadership. I think that could be okay for Prime Minister Abe. And actually another thing is preparing for G20. And actually strengthen the consensus and agreement among the G7, including France and Italy, and that could be okay for Shinzo Abe. So this is what Shinzo Abe is trying to do at this moment.
On the other hand, Mr. Paul, whether it is Japan, whether it is Italy, and whether it is some of the other European economies, even though not necessarily part of the EU, for example, Switzerland and some of the others, have all been working with China, whether it's MOU or other kinds of ways to work on infrastructure, even though the US, Washington now, has very different opinions about the BRI. So you see so many different kinds of cooperation going on among the other players, despite of the fact that there is strategic common ground between Japan and, let's just say, United States. But it seems that there are so many different ways the other economies are working now, except Washington, Mr. Paul.
Well, that's an issue, and I've taken many opportunities to complain about where my government has been going. I think we're missing chances to work together. The cooperation and the Belt and Road Initiative has become more palatable for Europeans and Japanese because China has picked up its game and it's made it a more transparent and principle-guided process where corruption is being rooted out as possible, and where the countries can sign up to high principles of cooperation. Japan itself is already putting money into a joint project with China in eastern Thailand to improve railroad connectivity there. And we'll be seeing more of that now that the Italians have signed up. I was in Greece earlier this year. The Greeks are very enthusiastic about building on the Chinese investment in the port of Piraeus, despite the fact that the U.S. is very suspicious about this. So I think the momentum is moving in the direction of greater cooperation. At some point, the U.S. is going to have to catch up with it.
I see. Mr. Liu, a lot of divergence going on all at the same time. That makes things ever more fascinating. But let's come back still to our topic, which is the Prime Minister Abe's visit to the European countries, Canada, and the United States. So eventually, Mr. Liu, from China's perspective, how is China observing this trip? Obviously, some suggest over the past few years, the Trump administration, with the way it's been doing things, even though it's changing, some suggest, have been putting unlikely partners together. So, Mr. Liu, how is China observing this trip made by Prime Minister Abe?
I think from the perspective of China, we would like to see this visit from a positive way because a major objective of Germany Prime Minister Abe's visit is to make a consensus for the G20 summit, which is a very important multilateral platform for international corporations. If this visit can achieve a concrete result, that will benefit all the G20, maybe the whole global economy. And for this visit, I think because we can find the differences between Japan and the United States, we know there are still trade tensions and talks between the two sides. If these two biggest economy can narrow their gap, that will be good news even for China.
Now, Mr. Kato, before the Prime Minister's trip to the EU, Canada, and the United States, the Foreign Minister of Japan already in China. Obviously, there must be some consultations going on between the two economies and the government. Mr. Kato, how do you see the way Prime Minister Abe has been conducting his diplomacy?
I think Foreign Minister Kono Taro, actually he is well coordinated with Prime Minister Abe. I do not think there are any misperception or misunderstanding between the two. And I think like Kono Taro in very good English, he very internationalized insights. And I think between the two leaders, I think they are trusted to each other. And I think this is a kind of more continuous and consistent way of Japanese more kind of proactive and comprehensive diplomacy in this region.
Will Prime Minister Abe, Mr. Paul, before we go, be able to persuade Washington to develop in many consider as the positive direction, Mr. Paul?
Well, I think he's going to keep working on it. He's been visiting frequently with the President Trump, and he's been trying to move the U.S. along. I think he's got his expectations well under control. Let me say two things. One, G20 really, in the end, will always be about sources of global growth, cooperation to move the economies forward. There we start off with good news. China's first quarter has produced positive economic statistics against worries that that might not be the case. And so they're going in with a fairly good atmosphere for global growth to be sustained by China, which accounts for about 40% of growth these days. The second thing is that always G20 meetings are hijacked by last-minute news. Something happens and everybody's heads turn to this new subject. I think in this case it's likely to be the U.S.-China trade agreement. It's moving forward very slowly. It probably will not be ready before the G20 meeting, but I think by the G20 meeting we may have the unusual sight of Xi Jinping and Donald Trump signing a trade agreement in Osaka.
Well, we'll see. Mr. Liu, that's exactly the final question I want to ask you about. With all of these trips going on, we have in the back of our mind the U.S.-China trade negotiations certainly have a big impact on global partnerships and multilateral mechanisms in the future. Mr. Liu, your final thought.
Yes, I think the trade talks between China and the U.S. is very influential, and other international partners are observing these talks. We hope this talk can produce a positive result, and it will also be a good news for the future for the G20 summits in June.
All right, for now, I want to thank the three of you helping us to understand all the fast and the latest development. Douglas Paul, Kato Yoshikazu, and Liu Mingli. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you for being with us.